what's like the worst career advice that you keep seeing or hearing or something like somebody is trying to help or he's thinking he's helping, but in fact he has no idea.
There's a lot of that out there. A lot of bad career advice. Um, I don't know, man. What's the worst bit of career advice? I'd have to think on that because there's so much bad advice. Tor, what's some bad advice that you think people are peddling out there when it comes to career?
Putting me on the spot, eh?
Yes, yes,
I don't know. When it comes to advice given, I never really had any bad advice, but I think the key is to follow advice, not really thinking about it, because everybody's giving advice based on their own standpoint and their own experiences, etc. And I think the biggest danger here isn't so much the advice itself; it's more how you follow it, whether you take it into account or just kind of follow without thinking about it. Um, Plenty of advice has been given over time. Some I followed, some I didn't. But you have to kind of really think about it. It's always nice to get advice, but like I said, you always have to keep in mind that whoever is giving it has their own situation, their own background, and their own reasons for giving that type of advice.
yeah, absolutely. Austin, what's some bad career advice you've seen or heard of recently?
Um, that's a really interesting question, and
Yeah,
it is very informed by where you're coming from culturally. Because for me, I got a lot of advice about like from when I was a kid, like my dad sort of, or my parents didn't really care much about like accumulating and passing on wealth. So I got like a lot of that perspective of just sort of like, but I think maybe one is like turn this sort of blind thing of like turn what you're passionate about into a career. Like I think that can work for some people, but like so for example, like I in grad school I wrote a book of poems and I was an MFA for poetry. And I saw the reality of turning that passion for creativity and associative writing and language into a career, specifically like teaching poetry for a living or being a university professor and selling books and all these kinds of things. And that started sucking the joy out of it that I have. So I think um, the point that Rovik was making about, contextualizing that advice to your own circumstances. Like for me, I can find some of the things I enjoy in my work that I do now, whether it's communication, community, all these things. But I'm not like if I had to, write scripts like screenplays for a living or these things I've tossed around in my head, I think I would lose the joy of it. So it's like it's sort of balancing, like finding things you're good at and can get really much better at and turn into a career versus like following your passion. I think there's more nuance in that sort of career advice than is often given credence. That's what I would say.
yeah, yeah. And now, given some time, to think on it and take into consideration some of what I've heard here, I feel like the worst career advice I hear is blanket statements that people just assume will apply to everyone. I think any advice given needs to be definitely within context. So that's why anytime somebody comes to me for advice, like I don't just tell them to do something. Like I always come back with at least three or four questions. Like let me dig a little bit deeper, let me understand a little bit more, and then give you something that's going to be suited or tailored kind of for you or kind of more relevant to you. Um, it's when we start trying to use advice as like a prescription that it starts like to not work, right? I don't know if that made sense, but I think the worst,
That's really smart.
yeah,
That's really smart. I think that's sort of it's born of like the sort of ways in which we communicate on these platforms now. They almost are more prone to or more amenable to that sort of blanket statement and
mhm,
lacking the sort of follow-up context or the questions you need to ask yourself to dig into, like, is that right for me or in what context is that right for me? So I think that's a great point.
yeah, and a lot of I would say there's a lot of bad advice starts with why don't you just or just do or just this or just that, like as if it was that easy. Well, you want to be a data, why don't you just go and do these few things, and like even though I'm like, oh, go just do a project. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that. So that's why I always, try to say yes, do a project, but make sure you do it right. But yeah, a lot of the worst advice I think starts with the words just. Asha, what about you? What's some really horrible advice that you've gotten?
I've received a lot of advice that's terrible or good. I haven't received a lot of advice, especially when transitioning from individuals, but definitely from online. It's what you said, the blanket statements. You can do it in 4 months. Just concentrate. 2 weeks, you'll be done. That's the worst.
Yeah.
Putting a timeline on things.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the reason you probably don't get bad advice is because you give really good context. Like you're like, all right, this is my situation. This is what I'm working on. This is what I'm trying to do. Do you have any advice for me? How do I move a step forward or what have you? So I think that's probably why you tend to get advice. Christoph, was that helpful? What have you seen out there that's been really, really just not useful?
It just reminded me of it was like 2 months ago maybe when Andrew Jones had this post on LinkedIn that started that keep hearing this: you're not a real data scientist unless you something. You can do SQL, you do that. And I think that's like a really negative content that we find, and it would be very useful to just block this kind of content because it brings only negativity, and this is very biased by people who write it because they tend to give more importance to things that they already know. I mean, because they like compare themselves with others, and they like to think about themselves like they're better than others because they know that. So it's more important because they know that. It's like this kind of BS that makes something that it's supposed to be an advice, but it only brings negativity and like pressure on people who are starting and they think they're too slow or not smart enough or they're missing something, not job ready, something like that.
Yeah, dude, 100% agree. I hate those type of posts. I remember, dude, like years ago, not years ago, maybe like 2, maybe 3 years ago, and this post sticks out in my mind. And it was somebody that was like I respected a lot at the time, like is like an OG in the field, and they posted this asinine comment, which was, "You're not a real data scientist if you haven't been earning at least 6 figures for 3 years by the time you've turned 30." I'm like, what the fuck? Are you serious, man? Like that is the stupidest piece of, like, what are you talking about? I don't know if they're being facetious or if they were just, that's actually how they felt. Knowing this person's track record and how they have been posting, that's actually how this person probably felt. And I was like, dude, you're a person that people look up to a lot. Like you can't be saying shit like this. Let's go to Austin, then Koshal.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one last thing on this real quick. I think I said something about the platforms. I think there's something about the platforms on which this advice is a lot of times shared where like things like that stir up controversy or stir up emotion, even if they're negative, are the things that get people more attention. So it's almost like there's sometimes you have to tease out like who's really trying to help you versus who is trying to get your attention. And some people are good at doing both. And like the best people I've found and the people I follow, like Harpreet, you are an example of this. I know Mark, who sometimes joins us, is an example of this. They're teaching us something through their advice. They're not just pitting people against each other. And it's so easy to get attention by pitting people against each other, saying things that are controversial. And it's just like a bullshit detector. It's like, you got to learn how to sniff that out. And it gets easier over time to do that, but you have to like really be aware of that because you can get sucked into that cycle of negativity so quickly and feel bad about yourself.